Achar Tzahorayim Tovim, good afternoon. We are intending to start on time and to end on time as well, because there's another more public session at 5 o'clock, and we want to make sure everybody gets enough tea, coffee, and akamod, aspirin, before the 5 o'clock session. For some reason, my colleagues don't have nameplates, and they will appear at some point or another. I want to introduce this session really very briefly and say that essentially for the last 2 days, since Tuesday evening, we have been going around the topic of the future of democracy in the Middle East. I don't think one speaker has avoided in some way or another alluding to the subject, and in some cases under other titles succeeded in devoting most of their remarks to this subject. But this panel really is the culmination, I think, and hopefully the elaboration of what is an extraordinarily important and pertinent issue for all of us who live in the region and for scholars of democracy in general. And therefore it's a special pleasure because we have an illustrious panel, and I see illustrious scholars of the topic in the audience as well. I've asked the speakers to really to speak for 25 minutes to give ample time for discussion, because I think the purpose of academic conferences is to discuss and not just to speak out. And therefore we have 3 panelists. I will introduce each one just before they speak, but the first speaker is Professor Yoram Meital, who also chairs the Herzog Center at Ben-Gurion University. He is a scholar of Egyptian politics primarily, but also has written on the Arab-Israel conflict, really one of the leading scholars of the Middle East in Israel. This year, Yoram is at Harvard University, so he's actually on a home visit. He's not supposed to be here. What you're seeing is a shadow of himself. But you will see that the shadow speaks well and wisely. And Yoram will talk about people power and the struggle for democracy in Egypt. Yoram, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Naomi, for this very kind introduction. I will not speak mainly on democracy. I'm going actually to disappoint some of the audience who listened carefully to the end of the previous session when Professor Gelnur actually promised that the next session will come out with the whole of the answers, all of the answers to what is going to be in the Middle East or in Egypt and other places. So this is not my presentation, mainly because I don't know what is going to be not only in the far future, even not in the near future, and I don't think that this is our task as academicians, scholars, to try to predict what will be the future of democracy or other such major issues in academic conferences. Tomorrow, Friday, yet another major demonstration will be held at Tahrir Square. I guess that most of you are not aware of this. This is going to be a very special occasion. Once again, civilian parties such as the Youth Revolution Council and the 6 April movement will call their supporters to participate in a demonstration that they call, the slogan is, Friday of Defending the Revolution. Now, I would ask, defending the revolution from who? And the answer, I think, is very relevant to the argument that I will try to establish in the next 25 minutes sharply, as Naomi asked. Well, not few political parties are perfectly aware that today the fear of hijacking the revolution is not coming from the Muslim Brotherhood, and it's not coming from the Salafists, but mainly the fear for most Egyptians that hijacking the revolution could come from a continuation of the rule of the army in Egypt. And defending the revolution under this banner tomorrow is directly a message, a very blunt message to this Supreme Council of the Armed Forces that not few in Egypt who actually propelled the revolution in January that led to toppling the Mubarak regime are not happy with the transition stage that the army is, of course, responsible since February 2011. Now, the dialogue between the Army Supreme Council and the forces of civilian society is characterized by a positive, in general, a positive view of the army and huge suspicion of the senior commanders. We should take this into account. The perception of the army does not necessarily mean the perception of Tantawi in Egyptian eyes. Especially the suspicion is coming out of fear that up until this moment, the Security Council did not release something that the Egyptian could see as a roadmap for the transition stage. A roadmap, how we go from here. Of course, we'll need more specific answers and signs on major questions. It's not about democracy. All Egyptians support democracy, including the army, but about the very specific of transition into a more stable situation following the toppling of the previous regime. Now, remind all of us when the uprising had started back at the beginning of 2011, the demonstrators raised two main slogans. The first was, the people ask or demand end of the Rais, or the president. So the call was, Irhal, go away. He didn't, and now he stands a trial. But they offered him, go away, take the Tunisian Ben Ali way and go to Saudi Arabia. This was the first and the easiest task. It took them 18 days with more than 800 civilian casualties. This is not a small number. And they got rid of Mubarak. But the second slogan was very much more broad and more difficult to be achieved. And this was, the people want toppling the regime. الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام, the regime in general. Now, this is very interesting for any of us who would like to look into the new political situation or context in Egypt. Well, this is not the first conference on what is coined as the Arab Spring, as we all know. We are running from a conference to the next one. And in not few cases, you can find a lot of discussion about the model. Are the Egyptians are going the Turkish model, the Tunisian model, any model coming from Europe or maybe Indonesia? There are many, many ideas and discussions about this. I would like to point as much as emphasis as I can in this lecture that for the vast majority of the Egyptians, the model is their own historical experience. And when you say today in Egypt the word revolution, until January this year, revolution meant only one thing, the 1952 July 23rd revolution. And this is extremely relevant to our discussion about the new context in Egypt. In 1952, when the officers had their coup, they deposed the king. And they promised democracy. This was one of the 6 main aims of the revolution. They promised dignity. They promised a lot. But very soon, they got into a very brutal conflict with the civil society and parties in Egypt. And at the end of the day, they imposed a new system of ruling, a new constitution, and the army kept in his place or in the regime for the next 60 years. Mubarak is the end of this same process. No one elected Mubarak as a president. In 1981, he replaced Sadat, who was assassinated, as we all know, on October 6, 1981. And no one actually elected Sadat to inherit Gamal Abdel Nasser when he passed away on September 28, 1970. And no one actually elected Gamal Abdel Nasser to become the president. Now, in the eyes of most of the Egyptians, this is the most direct experience of a revolution. From here coming the fears. This is the base for the political discussion. Are we today, 2011 and 12, are facing a similar or close situation to where our fathers and mothers and sisters and daughters had been in 1952, 1953, and 4? This is a major question with many lessons. So when we look from the outside on Egypt, we can come with all kinds of ideas about models. They have their own experience, the Egyptian model. Even further, or more further, Egypt is not Tunisia and not Yemen and not Syria. Egypt has its own, for good or worse, its own perception of what Egypt means, not only in the very domestic Egyptian political context, but in the perception of the region, the perception especially of the Arab world. The centrality of this state could not be shelved out like, okay, it was during Abdel Nasser's time. This is by far more important aspect to be examined in this context of talking about the revolution. But there is something new that came to the forefront directly from the uprising in January and February this year. And I would argue that for the first time, we did not have only hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, of citizens taking the risk and going against the brutality of the stick, the nabut, of the mukhabarat or the police or other forces. For the first time, we had noticed the beginning of a making of a new political language and awareness. It was about citizenship. But it was first and foremost about dignity. Not democracy, dignity. The way that the regime looked upon the citizens. The way that a policeman, who of course symbolizes the regime, have the rights to slam your face just because you were not meeting his expectations for answer or anything. For the first time, we have this new political organizations that on the top of their demands stand a word of dignity, live in freedom. To live in freedom in the sense that you can feel proud to be an Egyptian and do not to play these games in the face of foreigners and talking about the glories of Egypt and all this, but you know that the situation is terrible for many years. Dignity in political terms today is under a very severe test, I would argue. Just have a look at what happened with the demonstrations of the Copts and the way that they brutalized by the, in this time, by the armed forces, soldiers who driven cars on demonstrators, killing more than 20 citizens. And this was not the first and the only episode. This reminds many Egyptians of the fear that revolution is far from being ended. And if it depends on the army, the transition phase could be stretched wide and take not many months, but maybe many years. So the fear here is that we are watching the old film of this 1952 revolution and the way that it actually ended. Now, talking about the new political map, this is very important. We all raised here the question of political Islam movements and the Muslim Brotherhood especially. Now, this is very important. 2 points I would like to make here. Actually, 3. Very brief, Naomi. The first point is that the Muslim Brothers are not a unified movement. There are major differences, conflicts within this movement. As far as we go to the Mubaraks and Sadat and Abdel Nasser time, all right, under these regimes, the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood had the privilege, if not the duty, to lead. In both terms, spiritual and political. But under the revolution or under post-Mubarak Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood are going into a very complex situation. And one example, what is coined as the young Muslim Brotherhood, actually are taking a different route from the way that the leadership asking them. So the leadership decided, for example, that tomorrow Muslim Brotherhood are not going to join the demonstrations in Tahrir. But if you go to websites of the young Muslim Brotherhood, you will see that they are going to take place. to participate. Second point, in Mubarak's time, and of course during Abdel Nasser and Sadat, Muslim Brotherhood were the sole alternative almost. Not really political life and parliament. Now today, expectations at least, that at the coming elections at the end of November for the parliament, when they will end, we will have a vivid parliament. Maybe the Muslim Brotherhood could lead a coalition in this parliament, most likely. They are major and central force, but being the sole and the only alternative to the regime, this is something that it's not relevant to our discussion about Egypt political new map. The third point about the Muslim Brotherhood is that if I made that much of emphasis on the July Revolution, they were at that time in the 1950s and the 60s the first to pay the price of the revolution. Their suspicion of the military taking over is so deep-rooted in their mindset, especially of the leadership. They served years as political prisoners under Abdel Nasser. This is a vivid memory for most of them. The leadership of the very Muslim Brotherhood today, the personal leadership, they all were political prisoners under Abdel Nasser. They've been tortured by investigators from the army and the Mukhabarat. 5 minutes. Now, I think, and I would like to put it as in a bit more provocative way, just for the cause of the discussion, that the more interesting factor in this context is this young, non-organized, civil forces who are not the Muslim Brotherhood and who are not the old parties and are not the new parties. These are the forces that are going tomorrow to the square defending the revolution from the army. All of the others would like to play the same cards. They do not intend to play the same cards. Now, just to run to 2 points in the conclusion. One, I think that no one can exclude a second revolution in Egypt. I will not exclude a second revolution in Egypt. It seems that not few in Egypt in the political discussion understand that without a more severe stand against the army will not go back to the barracks and bless, the new democratic Egypt. So this is the first point. The second point is that no doubt that the Egyptian revolution of January 25 has gained significant achievements. But these are the beginning of a very long way, very long journey, packed with obstacles to the realization of the main aims: live in dignity, provide some or more equal chances for most Egyptians. The establishment of a civil government is just a mechanism to promote these aims. Elections are not democracy, not in Egypt and not in any other place. It's not about elections. It's not about casting the votes. If Egypt goes elections soon, and we will have a coalition, for example, between the Muslim Brotherhood and the army, most of these young forces or movements will not accept this endgame. Now, the overthrow of President Hosni Mubarak does not constitute a new page in the history of Egypt. Rather, it is the beginning of an entire new chapter in the history of this country. It affects both the society, as I briefly try to describe here, and it affects or will affect more and more the regime that at the end will be established, and it is likely to bring about significant changes in government and policy. I did not talk here about changes in policy, but it will most likely will bring major changes in policy, including toward Israel. This in turn, or all these in turn, may well affect other societies and regimes in the Middle East, in light of Egypt's central status in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Meital. Our next speaker is Dr. Muriel Asseburg, who heads the Middle East and African Affairs Division of the Institute of International and Security Affairs in Berlin. She holds a PhD from Munich University, which she wrote on the Palestinian state, and has worked extensively on issues of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, on political change in the region, and on also matters of economic reform. And she has worked, besides in Berlin and Munich and Jerusalem, also in Beirut and in Damascus, if I'm not mistaken, and in the U.S. that happens as well. Dr. Asseburg will discuss a little broader perspective, and that is the Arab world between revolt, political opening, and repression. So please.
Thank you, Naomi. And thank you actually for organizing these conferences, to the organizer, because I tremendously enjoy being here and participating in the discussions. I will exactly do what you said. I want to broaden the look a little bit away from Egypt and try to see what is happening in the Arab world. I expressly want to focus on the Arab world rather than the Middle East, because I think the Arab Spring has brought back to our mind how intense the societal connections between the different Arab countries and identity issues that are linked to being Arab rather than being part to some geopolitical entity that is defined by others as the Middle East. I think what we have been witnessing is that the protests, the revolts, the revolutions over the last 10 to 11 months in the Arab world continue a watershed. A development that is rightly being compared to 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and we have heard that here too, but only in the sense of being a historic turning point for the Arab world, not when we look at the outcomes or the expected outcomes. At least that is my reading. And I think it is a watershed in the sense that it will leave none of the Arab countries unaffected. And we're already seeing this, because even though the media focus is so much on Egypt, Tunisia, Bahrain, maybe Syria, protests have been taking place in all but one or two of the Arab countries. Of course, with very different demands, with very different impact on societies, on the political regime so far. But still, except for the Comoros and Qatar, we have seen protests taking place in all the countries of the Arab world. Now, in some of these countries, and we have started to speak about that, that has opened the chance for transformation towards more representative, towards more just, more inclusive political and economic systems. In others, regimes have felt under enormous pressure to react and to appease populations, but in substance, so far, little has changed. And still, I would say, historical turning point, even though, of course, that does not imply that everything will change in the region. It does not imply that everything will change towards more competitive and more inclusive political and economic systems. Already now we can see the very different speeds and the very different developments that different Arab countries take in the region. And we see how, after the very quick fall of rulers like Ben Ali and Mubarak, others cling to power. And they do this by employing a mix of political concessions, of socio-economic ad hoc measures, and at times brutal force. And of course we are seeing that in Bahrain, in Syria, in order to put protests down, in order to maintain the status quo. I think it's remarkable to see that every time the rulers do employ violence, actually it doesn't lead to the protests dying down quickly, but to the contrary. It radicalizes the demands of the protesters, it fuels the protests, and it delegitimizes the rulers even further. Now, that does not imply that I assume that protesters will overcome necessarily in each of the cases. I think that some of the regimes still do have the repressive capacities to win the tugs of war that we see between populations and regimes, and Syria might unfortunately be one of these cases. A side remark, I think that sanctions against such regimes might be a very important political signal, but might in the end have a counterproductive effect, because they make populations even more dependent on the regime's patronage system, the networks, for their sheer survival. So maybe that is something that might be discussed. So my first conclusion is that for the time being and for the years to come, quite a number of the Arab authoritarian systems will be persisting. And it's therefore too early to speak now about the end of Arab autocracies. At the same time, I think it's important to really look at what is happening. We should not confuse the resignation or the ouster of long-term rulers with regime change. In Libya, I would say that the end of the Gaddafi era automatically implies regime change, because it was a system that was so much based on this personal rule and the constant re-changing of institutions, of lines of authority, and so on. In Egypt, and Yoram has spoken about that, regime change has at best been partial so far, and I think it risks to remain so, with the military, as part of the former regime, set to remain major influence and probably not to become or not to be put under civil and democratic control anytime soon. In the years ahead, what we should expect then is not only a phase of instability, of a phase of ongoing struggle between people and regimes, but also a wider spectrum of systems opening and systems being closed again. I think we already see some models evolving, and I assume that Amal will be speaking about that. Now, some of the regimes, the authoritarian systems, try to maintain the status quo with a very minimal attempt at political reform. Others embark on more comprehensive reform, but still do not touch the essence of rule. And others have embarked on a path of regime change and of political and socio-economic transformation. And if you want so, you can have a continuum with Saudi Arabia, being on the one end of it, and on the other you have Tunisia and Morocco and Jordan somewhere in between. Now, I also think that we should expect violent power struggles that might, in some cases, descend into civil war, and Yemen and Syria are, and that is obvious, I guess, two countries where that might happen rather sooner than later. That might lead to breakdown of state institutions as well as the end of territorial integrity in these countries. And of course, that will have very severe repercussions on sub-regional stability. But, and this is why I say all of the Arab countries will be affected, all of the rulers actually are in need to renew their legitimacy. And their room for maneuver has become substantially smaller. The ad hoc measures that they have adopted, such as increases in food subsidies and oil subsidies, the limited opening of political systems, will be very difficult to maintain in this very limited measure. And also I think there have been very clear signals to all rulers that they do not enjoy impunity. And that is important for them to understand, and it's more important even, I think, for populations to understand that this is the case. That rulers can and will be brought to justice nationally or internationally. So my assumption is, even though I know about the problematic aspect of predicting, my assumption still is that regimes will not stay the same, and they all will have to adapt. They will have to take people's will much more into account than what was previously the case, and they will have to embark on economic and political reform, and in the end that will amount in all of the cases to, if limited, gradual regime change. Now, what does that mean for the future of democracy in the region, as the title of the panel asks? I want to speak mainly about a context in the region which I consider to be very much not conducive for democracy. Before I do so, two caveats. One is that, of course, the political, the societal, the economic, as well as the regional international conditions in each of the country varies, and it makes sense to really look into each of the cases rather than being very general, but the factors that I'm going to be naming, of course, can be, you can run through them and look at them for each of the countries. The second is, I think that agency is critically important. And agency probably is the one factor that is most difficult to predict. When we see who brought about the change in Tunisia and in Egypt, I think that is very encouraging. And it encourages us also to look for a better future. Young people striving for freedom, for dignity, for bread, allying themselves, middle-class young people allying themselves with labor unions, with the professional associations, with the former more elite-centered protest movements, with young Islamists, and in this being able to bring about change. Now, it's very early days. But what we see at this current point of time is that these movements have not been able so far to transform that social mobilization into political influence. Political influence maybe is there in the sense of having a spoiler role, but not in actively trying to influence political decisions. And maybe that brings us to one of the problems that we discussed yesterday about the question of how appropriate is it to try to channel that into party activity in a time where the influence of parties is generally receding. What we see is that they have a very hard time in combating with former regime and other status quo forces. And what we also see is that former anti-regime coalitions, that goes for Tunisia, that goes for Egypt, that goes for Libya, are already breaking apart. And probably the more violence was involved in the original struggle to get rid of the regime, the more we can expect the struggle between the former allies against the regime also to be of a more violent nature. And I think that fear became very clear when you listened to the speech that the head of the Transitional Council in Libya gave at the occasion of liberation. The fear of that breaking down into violent conflict among those who brought about the change. Now, having said that, I want to make sure that I'm not being misunderstood. I think really that agency is important, that actors are important, and actually it is in their hands to change things. And that is why nothing is predetermined. Having said that, transformation in the Arab countries takes place in a very challenging environment. And as I said, I think that environment is not conducive to democracy. And I want to enumerate or dwell on three factors here, three factors that I think we haven't been sufficiently speaking about during the conference. One of them is society. The second one is development, human development, and political economy. And the third one is geopolitics. Let me start with society. And in this, actually, I would beg to differ with what Larry Diamond said in the beginning. I see most Arab societies as very much divided, fragmented ethnically, tribally, and confessionally. And in many cases, and we spoke about that this morning in depth, we see that states' borders and identities are not congruent at all, and that the manipulation of such identities by authoritarian rulers has led, in many cases, in many countries, to a situation where you have very deeply ingrained hatred between communities. Iraq is one example, Syria would be another one, Lebanon, and so on. Now that makes it very difficult to achieve consensus on basic values, on questions of identities, on questions of citizenship, on which then to build democracy, on which then to build a system of equality, a merit-based system, rather than one that is based on communal representation. And we have seen, when we look at Lebanon, that consocialism is only partly satisfactory in that regard, because it always keeps the country in a situation where there is danger of descending into civil strife. It produces a system which is extremely inefficient. It's marked by very strong nepotism, clientelism, and lack of real competition. And it also produces a situation where you don't have broad-based civil society organizations with overarching interests, and you don't have political parties that go beyond political communities. Now, I really want to be rightly understood here. These traditional small group loyalties, tribalism, asabiyyah, are an obstacle, but I don't want them to be conceived in an essentialist fashion. Religion and culture are not fixed and uniform, but they're constantly changing. And they are, of course, adapting to changing circumstances. And that is, of course, the case with higher levels of modernization, with higher levels of literacy, modern employment, women education, and so on. Still, the greater the current level of fragmentation, the bigger the challenge to find consensus on the basis of which then to move on. And without national identity, the danger that electoral competition exacerbates communal conflict is there. The second factor, or the second group of factors, if you want so, is concerned with human development and political economy. When we look at the Arab world today, with very few exceptions, we see that levels of modernizations are low, in particular if measured against GDP per capita. That is particularly the case when you look at human development, and I think here we really have to be careful not to be led astray by the catchword of Facebook revolutions, because this term really papers over some of the very profound deficits, like very high poverty rates in some of the Arab states, like 40% in Egypt, very high illiteracy rates in many of the Arab states, very low schooling, for example, when you look at female secondary schooling. And of course, it papers over that penetration of the internet is rather low in most of the Arab countries, with the exception of the Arab Gulf countries, Tunisia, Lebanon, and the PA. Also, in many of the Arab countries, we don't have anything like an independent bourgeoisie or entrepreneurial class, which has been identified by many transition scholars as being the backbone of building democracies, not necessarily for bringing about change, but to then build democracies together in a democratic coalition with the middle classes and the working classes. And I think in these two factors are mostly relevant, one of them being that economic reform over the last 2 decades has led to partial privatization and liberalization. We have also spoken about that before, but not to the simultaneous enactment of market mechanisms and social policies. So as a consequence, we have seen an increase in gaps in income and wealth distribution. We have seen the emergence of a class of crony capitalists that, of course, have very different aspirations than independent entrepreneurs, in the sense that they are mainly focused on maintaining privileged access to state monopolies, licenses, etc., and not in the rule of law or more liberty. We have at the same time seen an erosion of the social contract on which most of the populist authoritarian Arab states were built, and it is, I think, no coincidence that the revolutions or the rebellions in Tunisia started more in the countryside, and the same goes for Syria. The third, it's the second factor actually, is the special feature that is relevant for many of the Arab states' political economies, and that is rentierism, and it has also already been mentioned. I think we see very clearly that in this region, ordinary people are highly dependent on the state for their livelihoods, and that has deterred many of them to demand the end of repression and more representation. At the same time, we have seen the states or the regimes being much more oriented towards the outside than towards their own populations. Now, that has been a factor in the past. I think it will be a very important factor in the future when we see how regimes can look like once they embark on a political transition. And it's not only a factor that is important for the resource-rich Arab states in the Gulf countries, but it is also important for those receiving political rents, and that is, above all, Israel's neighbors, that is, Egypt and Jordan. The last point is about geopolitics, and I think this is one of the points that we really haven't touched upon enough. It seems to me that these transformations take place in a very unfriendly regional and international environment, in the sense that you have very strong forces, such as Saudi Arabia and Iran, acting as sponsors of the authoritarian status quo in each of the countries of the region, with different intentions and different instruments, but still powerful. We also have the US and the Europeans, while they have embraced the protest movements as being ideologically on the right side of history, they have reacted very hesitantly and they have reacted on a case-by-case basis, rather than adjusting their policies in a more general manner and readjusting above all their concept of stability to one that would be a more dynamic concept of stability. And still, geopolitical interests continue to dominate their policy approaches and determine their stances on what the appropriate level of change and continuity should be in each of the states of the region. Chief amongst them, of course, access to oil and gas according to reasonable prices, but also Israel's security, the containment of Iran, and for Europeans, the minimization of spillover effects of conflict in the form of irregular migration, terrorism, organized crime, etc. I'm coming to a conclusion. That brings me to a last point, and that is the persistence of the Arab-Israeli conflict that currently is being more and more overlapped and reinforced by the Israeli-Turkish tensions, by the competition over exclusive economic zones in the Eastern Mediterranean, and bears the danger of renewed violent escalation. Even if it does not violently escalate, it still has all the negative repercussions on the region, but also on the chances for transformation in the region, because it does produce oversized armies, it does produce a climate that is averse to investment, it does produce radical forces, or it strengthens radical forces, and it further weakens states and strengthens non-state armed actors. And all of that, of course, is not conducive to more democracy, more just systems. Now, really, as a conclusion, that leads me to say that it would be much more important that those who want to support democratization in the region and who say that they reconsider much more these more structural factors than just being concerned about political Islam and just investing into very short-term measures of democracy promotion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, also for reminding us of the importance of structural factors, and especially the geopolitical factor, which I admit has been notably absent, except perhaps in the background from our discussions. The last speaker in this panel is Dr. Amal Jamal, is senior lecturer at Tel Aviv University, until recently chair of the Department of Political Science. I must admit that although I know the other panelists for some time, I've known Amal the longest because he was my student in Introduction to Political Science, and I've learned more from him over the last 20 years than from most of my students, and he's now a colleague and my teacher. So it's a special pleasure to introduce Amal, please. Amal will talk about a comparative analysis of democratization and monarchical versus Republican regimes.
Yeah, thank you, Naomi. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thanks for the organizers. I think when we talk about democratization processes, especially in the Middle Eastern context, I would like to reiterate that something that was said several times already, that we're not talking about a monolithic, one direction, unified, homogeneous process. We are talking actually about a fluid situation, and therefore we have to speak about it in flexible terms that try to understand the situation without predetermining the future. Democratic transition does not and cannot be based on a pre-given recipe and clear steps. Actually, democratization is a complex process, as many of us here have said. It's composed of expansion of political participation. It sometimes include recession of political participation. It has to do with public sovereignty, changes in public sovereignty, and the meaning of public sovereignty here is very, very complicated. Somebody spoke yesterday and even today about different models of democracy, and therefore democratization doesn't have to lead to a certain type or certain model of democracy. I think, and I would like to claim that democracy is not the intention, but rather the result of political action. And this way I would like to look at what's happening in the region, especially in the Arab world. This process could be long, and the first thing that comes to mind is actually the French Revolution and the establishment of French democracy. When we look at what happened in French history, it took more than decades until democracy was established. And even somebody had said this morning that the first time we can speak about American democracy is in the mid-1960s, although the American Revolution took place in the 18th century. We're talking about an open process where political forces join efforts, not because they want to share power, as much as they have to share power. And we have seen that in the Arab world very clearly, that different streams of political actors have joined forces in order to topple the regime in Egypt, in Tunisia, now in Syria, that actually don't like each other very much, but have to share power in order to lead to regime change. One of the most important challenges is their ability to continue to play together in order to establish democracy in the future. I think I'll come to that a bit later. But before I go into my comparison, I would like to cite one sentence said by Sheila bin Habib, who says, and I'm citing here, defining the identity of the democratic people is an ongoing process of political self-creation. I think this is the most important thing about democracy. It's a self-creation process, and therefore an important access point in order to assess the processes taking place in the Arab world is to widen the scope, to widen our look, and compare with the past. I attended the talk given by Professor Shlomo Avner yesterday, and actually he did that very nicely. I would like to reiterate certain points that I plan to speak about anyway, concerning democratization processes that took place in Eastern Europe, although comparisons draw our attention to similarities, they draw our attention to contrast and differences, and therefore it's important to do it sometimes. And first comparison that I would like to make, it demonstrates the centrality of several points, the most important of which are, the first one, despite the fact that we are talking about a bloc of countries, and of course I'm meaning here the Eastern Bloc as well as the Arab states, each of the states has its own particularities, and we have to take that into consideration. Second, there is a domino effect that copies changes from one state to another, something that we have seen in Eastern Europe as well as we are seeing in the Arab world. This doesn't mean that the same processes will take place. Nevertheless, the fall of one regime influences the stability of other regimes, and I think what happened in Tunisia instigated what happened later on in Egypt, and then in Libya, and now in Syria, and so on and so on. So there are similarities as well as differences that have to be taken into consideration. The third point is democratization is not a rigid, clear process that could be examined with clear tools all the time. It is a complex process that could be divided into several, but mainly overlapping and converging stages that I would like to put forward. The first one is the rise of public mobilization and widespreading of protest, or what I would call in the Arab context the end of fear, from the regime. The second is the downfall of the authoritarian regime, and this could be a long process also. Whereas, as Yoram said, Mubarak left power after 18 days. We're looking at, if we look at Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, or we look at Bashar Assad in Syria, it's going to take a long process if they leave power at all. The third point is the establishing of a transitional authority, which is very, very important, something that we have been seeing taking place in different ways in Tunisia as well as in Egypt and in Libya now. I think this period is very, very sensitive that we have to look at, and I think what's taking place in these three states show us that this transitional period is very crucial as to what could happen in the future, and what Yoram said about Egypt is very, very indicative. Very indicative that traditional political and military forces are not willing to give up power so fast, and they will find any manipulation possible in order to maintain their political power, if not directly, then indirectly. And if we look more closely at what happened in Egypt, or what happened in the recent elections in Tunisia, we can see that many of the forces that were, many of the elites that were very powerful during Ben Ali's period have come back in this guise or another. 4 point in this transitional, in this democratization process is the founding period in which elections take place and the new constitution is established. And I think we can look at what's happening in Tunisia as a good example of this period. Of course, this doesn't mean that democracy will be established. Even if these processes take place and these stages are taking place on the ground, this doesn't mean that democratization process is taking place. Democratization process takes place when routinization of democratic norms and procedures start being established, and it's premature to start speaking about such a period in the Arab world. We are in the middle of changes, and really it's difficult to do any analysis that will enable us to see what's happening clearly. Another point that is important in our comparisons that could be learned from other experiences is that two main factors compete for influence during the democratization process, or any upheaval, any political upheaval, and the interplay between them determine the nature of the process in the future. One is culture as structure. And here I would like to point out the difference between speaking about culture as norms, as beliefs, as Islam in our context, and speaking about culture as social structure, as societal culture in other terms, meaning that what is accepted in society, what is conceived to be normative in society, and here we can speak about tradition, we can speak about history, we can speak about certain norms, we can speak about religion, but religion is one factor only. We can speak about identity. This culture as structure is very important because it determines actually the spaces of behavior and the norms and the patterns of behavior for social actors. And I would like here to speak about, to reiterate what Muriel had said about agency. Actors. Actors are not disconnected from their social structure, from their surrounding, and they behave within structures, and structures actually determine, to a certain extent, the horizons of possibilities available for political actors. And I think we have to look at that when looking at what's happening in the Arab world. And the second important issue here, the second important grand factor is political economy, was also mentioned by several people. Larry mentioned it on the first day, Muriel mentioned it also today. And here we're talking about class structure, distribution of wealth, and economic interests. Of course, when we talk about these factors, I'm not talking about social actors only, but also the state, the interests of the state as an agent that has its own interests in the local scene as well as in the geopolitical scene, which have to be taken into consideration. And of course, the experience from other revolutions, from other political upheavals, from democratization processes, where else show that any dichotomy between them doesn't hold very much. The interplay between cultural factors and economic factors determine the possibilities and show the way for future developments. And when looking deeply, without repeating what Muriel had said about what's happening in the Arab world, I think social structure, including cultural factors such as tradition, history, norms, religion, and so on and so on, is playing a major role in determining the possibilities of the political actors in the region. But when speaking about culture as structure, I'm not speaking about something closed, something that is given, but actually about something that is loose, that is negotiated between political actors, that could be changed, that could be negotiated and renegotiated, and norms as well as patterns of behavior as well as traditions could change. And I think the most important factor in this regard is the fact that new social agents enter the political scene that are unwilling to accept tradition and history the way it was in the past. And if we look at movements in Egypt, for instance, Kifaya is one example, but not only Kifaya, but also unorganized youth that have studied, some of them have studied in the West, some of them have studied in Egypt, middle-class youth that is demanding change without ignoring the fact that there are organized political forces, including the Muslim Brotherhoods, that they are willing to negotiate with, that they're willing to speak to. This is taking place in Tunisia. It's taking place in Egypt. And most importantly, I think, if we look at Yemen as an example, the mobilization of women into the political scene. This is a very important factor. When we look at Yemen, women are very involved in what's happening, meaning that culture as structure doesn't mean that it's something closed, predetermined, that doesn't allow changes. And that's why I'm speaking about something loose that enable certain women, certain political agents, especially women, including women that are very traditional, with headscarves, to come out into the streets and protest and ask for change, because they have stakes in what's going on. Would this lead to democratization? Of course, I'm not saying that. I'm much more cautious than saying that. But I think we are seeing what several Arab commentators have said, a new Arab agent. A new Arab agent that is asking for change without definitely knowing what kind of change he or she wants and how it's going to develop in the future. But it became a trend. And trends are very, very important, as you know, from other contexts, social contexts as well as cultural contexts. Trends are very, very important, and we see a very important trend taking place. In order to demonstrate the importance of the interplay between culture as structure and political economy, I would like to focus more deeply on the comparison between monarchical regimes and republican regimes. And I think this access point is very important to point out several differences as well as similarities between different Arab states. When I speak about republican regimes, of course, in order to not to fall into a fallacy that we are talking about democratic regimes, we're talking about regimes that are called popular regimes that win their legitimacy by calling themselves, speaking in the name of the people, and addressing the aspirations of the people. And of course, the other side of the coin is monarchical regime. This differentiation is very important. And in order to make the comparison and make it as constructive as possible for our purposes, I posed to myself 3 different questions. One question is, why now? Why this took place? Why the upheaval took place now? What happened? And of course, why now could have implications on also what's going to happen in the future. I will come up to that in a minute. I would like to claim that it's a combination of two theoretical and empirical traditions that provide the best answer to this question, and I draw them from political theory. I bring them into our context. One is what is called in political theory relative deprivation, again political economy, and the second, structure of opportunities, which means coming from political theory. I think Naomi mentioned that yesterday. You mentioned Scotchpol, bringing the state back in, or I would like to use Nazir Ayubi, who wrote a book in 1995 about overstating the Arab state, claiming that despite the fact that Arab states are fierce, they are not strong states. In the contrary, because they don't have infrastructural power, they use force in order to impose their authority, in order to impose their power, in order to stabilize or pacify society. And of course, when we look at these two factors, relative deprivation and structural opportunities, we see that they are completely different in republican states vis-à-vis monarchical states, although some similarities could be drawn between few or 2 at least monarchical states and republican states. And here, when we talk about relative deprivation, I'm talking about certain factors that Muriel already mentioned, and that's why I can allow myself not to go into details. For instance, when we look at deprivation, look at the unemployment rate in most Arab countries, and I'm not speaking about oil countries. I'm talking about Egypt, I'm talking about Tunisia, I'm talking about Syria, I'm talking about Yemen, and so on and so on. The unemployment rate is very high in these countries. Poverty is very high. Social gaps have been growing rapidly in these states. And one of the most important phenomena that could be we could have seen in the recent period is the growing of a very influential but small economic elite that concentrates most of the country's resources into its hand, that is very closely tied to the regime. And of course, one of the best examples is in Egypt, where very influential functionaries in the ruling party were businessmen that actually concentrated a lot of economic wealth in their hands, using, of course, their political power in order to enhance their economic abilities. When we talk about opportunities, structure of opportunities, we have to speak about the legitimacy crisis that some people spoke about before in the morning in the Arab states, especially in the Republican states, where we see that the expectations that were flourished by the regime, that were claimed by the regime to be speaking in the name of the interests of the people, to speak about national security, to speak about hopes of a better future, were receding to an extent that could be reduced into what Walid Salim called yesterday Jumlukiya, meaning that from big horizons and rosy future, when this regime started, we ended up with Hafez al-Assad bringing up his son into power. Mubarak was preparing his son to come into power, and the differences between monarchical regimes and republican regimes the difference has closed down, and people have seen that the sources of legitimacy of the regimes vanished completely. Another point in this regard, of course, the weakening, the erosion of the state as a universal entity. The state as a universal entity, speaking in the name of the people, became reduced into an instrument in the hands of a very closed and small political and economic elite. And another important factor here is the existence of not very active but potentially active oppositionary actors, such as the Islamic movements in Egypt, inside the country, and Tunisia, outside the country, as well as in other states. The combination between deprivation, the day-to-day state of the average citizen, vis-a-vis the weakening of the state, and the best indicator in Egypt is actually Mubarak becoming very old, not able to function, have given the sense that new opportunities are opened up that have to be seized by social forces that have been suffering as a result of these of the policies of this regime. The second question I would like to ask here, very briefly, is why the difference? Why the difference between states? Of course, here I'm speaking about differences in the sources of legitimacy and the type of authority inside the different states. Popular regimes base their authority and legitimacy on universality, universal citizenship, of course, phony elections, and on the military / national security, whereas monarchical regimes establish their authority based on tribal and traditional authority or combined structure. In the republican regimes, we have some regimes speaking about revolutionary authority, such as in Libya, or oppositionary authority, such as in Syria. But the differences are very, very clear between Republican and monarchical. When it comes to economic structure, we can differentiate between wealthy states, and here we find Republican as well as monarchical states, all the oil exporting states, Republican Libya, monarchical, of course, Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states, whereas we can speak about poor states such as Egypt, Tunisia, but also monarchical states such as Jordan and Morocco. And here we see that monarchical, wealthy monarchical states buy the stability with their own wealth, redistribution of wealth, and what happened in Saudi Arabia, what happened in Qatar, what's happening in Oman now, what happened in Kuwait also is one of the best instruments to buy stability. But wealth is not enough, as we see in Oman, for instance. Political economy is not enough, and therefore some political reforms are taking place, such as elections, including also in Kuwait. In Qatar, there is a talk about such a possibility, and so on. But also in the weak monarchical states, we see that political reform, they can't redistribute resources, although some resources were transferred from Saudi Arabia, from other states to these weak states. They had to buy stability through serious political reforms. The new constitution in Morocco, the changes taking place in Jordan are the best example in order to illustrate these points. So we see always a combination between economic and political reforms have to be combined in order to deal with the situation. Last point last question: where are we heading? Like what's going to happen? How things are going to develop in the future? Of course, I'm not going to try to predict, but based on what I said until now, in the Republican regimes, I think new formulas of authority seems to be underway. The economic political elites will try to regain influence through new mechanisms of legitimation, and therefore they will be willing to compromise with whatever social force that guarantee their interests. Also, when this is an Islamic party, as in Tunisia, or I think is going to happen in Egypt, especially because of their political backing. Also, one such political formula doesn't mean liberal democracy. Or, in other words, the new legitimation processes have to be based on democratic procedures, although we cannot speak or won't be able to speak about substantial liberal democracy. In the monarchical regimes, the monarchies will keep using their wealth. The wealthy, of course, monarchies will keep using their wealth to buy peace and even help weak monarchies in order to ensure that the negotiations to join the attempts to help Jordan and Morocco by the Gulf states is an example, meaning that we are not talking about a process that will completely transform the Arab world into a new reality, continuing the pessimistic view that was presented by my previous speakers. I think that we are talking about a future that will try to balance political authority with new mechanisms of legitimation that may end up in the long run in democracy, but I don't foresee it in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amal. We do have at this point quite some time for discussion, So we'll take it. It seems to be rounds of 2 or 3. I saw Larry first and Wolfgang, and then you, sir.
Thank you all. This was a great session, excellent papers. I don't have time to raise all the questions of everyone I'd like to, so I'll concentrate on Dr. Asseburg's very sweeping and impressive commentary. And the main thing I'd say is I think it's necessary to really get a grasp on this to widen the comparative aperture. This is the point I was trying to make Tuesday night. To at least begin to look globally as well. Because many of the factors you cite, as being extremely unfavorable, and basically, I mean, I more or less agree with your conclusion. The immediate term prospects are not great. But you can find a lot of these in other parts of the world. I mean, you look for the absence of a bourgeoisie, massive poverty, clientelistic relations, people trapped in ignorance, and so on. Are most of the countries in this region, even the worst one in this regard, Yemen, worse off than Bangladesh, Liberia, Sierra Leone, that are all democracies? So I don't find the citation of that particular structural variable, that is the lack of a bourgeoisie, low human development, particularly persuasive in terms of auguring for extremely pessimistic view of democratic prospects. It's an unfavorable structural variable, to be sure, but I'd be cautious about that. So then you have to look and say, well, what are the factors in this part of the world that are distinctive relative to the other parts of the world? And I mean, you noted a number that I think are very important. The rentier economies, there's virtually not a single oil economy in the developing world that's a democracy. The fact that you have a very bad neighborhood, and I think one could go further than you did. It's not just Iran, then Saudi Arabia trying to prop up the authoritarian monarchies, which, by the way, is a very telling indicator of. Let me just finish for a minute, since I've been kind of pilloried over the last 2 days.
Oh, you haven't been pilloried. You've been challenged.
Well, in any case, so now I'd like to challenge back. It is an interesting indicator of the importance of diffusion effects. But, there's a point you didn't stress very much that I think is the single most unique factor in this region. And that is that in contrast to a lot of these other places, and in sharper contrast, say, to the Andean region, where you've got poverty, you've got structural factors that are giving rise to the Evo Moraleses of the world, and so, democracy is hanging in the balance. You have in this part of the world the availability of the only coherent or really powerful ideological alternative to democracy in the world, which is, authoritarian political Islam, not just political Islam, but authoritarian political Islam, and which Saudi Arabia is busy pouring vast amounts of money into the support of, which I didn't hear enough about, by the way, of the Salafists. Not even forget the Muslim Brotherhood. They may be the more benign alternative in Egypt. So, I think there's a need to be more searching in trying to identify the factors that are really distinctive to this region, rather than being so sweeping. And, I hate to say it because it doesn't augur very well, but where the forms of political Islam are really authoritarian, we can't really know until they've kind of unfolded over a long period of time, I think it may be the single most unfavorable factor.
Is that a full stop?
Yeah, well, I saw you looking at me.
But Larry, if you
restrained by the rule of law.
No. First of all, you're a true Democrat, and I appreciate that. But it sounded like you were in mid-thought, or you had another thought, and I didn't want.
Well,
after being chastised, I didn't want to be.
I have other thoughts, but we'll give other people a chance, and we can talk at the break, or maybe if there's more
Okay, thank you so much. Professor Merkel, please.
It's a follow-up to Larry. Theories help us to look not only back, but also to look into the future. And we have heard it more or less. There's modernization theory, there's structuralism, and there is actor-centered approaches. The first one, modernization theory, do not tell us about time. These are long-term, indeterminate phases. Some when it will happen, but they are blind on time. Structuralist theories tell us something about the balances between classes, the organization of classes, strong and weak states. These are midterm. They allow midterm prediction. Actor-centered theories are looking to the near future. I don't go into modernization theory. I disagree that there are bad conditions. If you compare it with other countries, they are not so bad. Structuralist is so and so, but actor-centered analyses would tell us, and I would like to ask you, you did not talk about elite settlements. At the beginning of each democratization and democracy, you need an elite settlement about the basic rules of the game. Which are the chances for this? If we look to the major actors, I cannot see the military, the Islamist groups, secularists, no parties. So I would like to hear something about the chances for elite settlement. A last point. I don't think they will fall, or we don't know, we should be cautious, but they may not fall back in open authoritarian regimes. But sometimes hybrid regimes are much worse than open authoritarian regime. They are more open to violence, they are more open to internal strife, they are more open to civil war. And I would like, so to say, last word, do we not have to expect some kind of tyrannies of majorities, as Tocqueville would have put it? And this may be even worse than soft authoritarian regimes.
Thank you. And the last one in this round. I see everybody who raised their hands, but you'll have to wait for a minute.
My question is to Professor Meital, concerning the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan Muslimin. They became more realistic and very hesitant because they were suppressed under Abdul Nasser, under Sadat, and under Mubarak. Therefore, they try to show they are more realistic. But some of the leaders, they wanted to join in the last month. They wanted to join demonstration, and they were debate among them. They were very hard discussion, and the majority decided not in every demonstration to participate. But until now, they are afraid to submit a candidate for the presidency. While yesterday there were in Egypt slogans to ask Tantawi to submit candidacy in the walls of the streets of Egypt. I saw in Al Jazeera. For the time being, I know only about Barad'i and Amr Musa. Maybe you can mention any possible candidate for the Muslim Brotherhood and what is
Thank you.
Expectation for the election will be who have the chances to be elected as president.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to figure out who. Wait. We're going to let the panelists engage and then continue. I think maybe Yoram, since this was a more specific question, if you can answer it very briefly, and then we'll move to Muriel and probably Amal.
It's going to be very brief. I don't know who is going to be the next president of Egypt. What most certainly I would like to add, following some of this point, is that in the balance of opportunities, successful transition to a pluralistic regime based on democratic values and risk a military or a theocratic regime, on this balance leads me to a conclusion that can be defined as a guarded optimism. I'm not pessimist as I may sounded by my presentation. I just wanted to provoke the discussion about this transitional phase. Now, the revolution or the uprising places Egyptian society, to my mind, in a much better position on the road to establishing a civil state based on democratic values. The transition stage is the most difficult to cross, of course. Now, when we discussed here in this conference the opportunities, and we raised just in general, Muslim Brotherhood was just on the air of these discussions, or not few of the speakers, I think that without giving that much of importance to the context of the new political map in Egypt, and in this session, this was my feeling that the three of us are actually sharing the same premise that includes 2 points. The one is that the very aims of crossing this transition phase is the surviving of the revolution, of this moment. Just to survive it, it is by itself an achievement. It's not enough to go to Tahrir Square and to demonstrate for 18 days or 3 months. If at the end of the day, the army or the Muslim Brotherhood will take over or hijack the revolution. This was not the aim for most of these demonstrators. The second point, we've all, I'm really meaning this, with all respect to the theories about transition phases. If we look into a more specific case studies, the Egyptian situation and context is not the one that we find in Libya or Tunisia. It is totally different. Yes, they are Arabs, and absolutely there are some structural frameworks that we should discuss and give importance, but at the very, I would say, heart of this revolutionary moment, maybe it's not a bad idea to differentiate between 2 instrumental stages or phases. The first is toppling down an authoritarian regime. Could be a very totalitarian like Gaddafi or Bashar al-Assad, or less totalitarian but much authoritarian regime like Mubarak or police state by Ben Ali. The toppling down of the regime was a dream for many years, for many Arab societies. Now this is a phase. The second one is the remaking of the system. Now when we look at the political discourse, I think that the most distinguished factor that is coming to mind is that no, we do not have, like I would say, a unified agenda. Of course not. Between Muslim Brotherhood and the left, between liberals and the new youth movement, no unified political movement. Was just very basic ideas. Opportunity to live free, to be respected or being given dignity by your own state, a chance for work, of course, and more, I would say, specific aims. And I'm sorry that I cannot answer your question about who will be the next president.
We all know that prophecy was given to children and fools, and nobody here is either. Muriel, do you want to? And then Amal, I'm sure you have some comments.
Starting with Larry, yes, that's very helpful to widen the perspective. I can only do it to a certain degree because I'm working on the Middle East. So this is helpful in discussing it. I'm not so sure if the most unique factor is authoritarian political Islam. And it seems to me that what we are witnessing currently in the region is the decline of the attractiveness of that model. That is also why I would say that I wouldn't be that afraid of tyrannies of the majority. It seems to me that what we are witnessing is a new concept with which those young people go and demonstrate. It's not ideological. It's the opposite of ideologies. And I very much expect that once new tyrannies are being established, people will go and demonstrate again and again and again. So I very much think that we will see more instability and not more stability and not a backlash to authoritarian systems. With the exception of those countries where there is, for the time being at least, people are not able to overthrow the system. I'm still also not sure if you mentioned rentier economy and then authoritarian political Islam or authoritarian ideologies. I still think that the geopolitical factor in this region is unique. The penetration of the region is unique. And so I would put that factor very much in front. Your question, Wolfgang, about elite settlements. I ask myself if, against the background of what we have just witnessed, that it still has the same importance as it has had 20 years ago. And I can't give an answer. Maybe you're in a better position to do that. But it seems to me, as we have ongoing social mobilization, and we will have ongoing social mobilization, maybe elite settlements is not enough. And for the time being, the incapability of those who are mobilized to really have a say in decision-making will recreate this constant change and will not allow for elite settlements, if they take place, to be constant or to serve as a basis then for transition. The first question goes back to what I said about fragmentation of societies. I think we see in some of the cases that there will not be elite settlements because of the fragmentation of societies. And that goes for Libya, where we see that the elite pact that might have been there before the transition started is now crumbling because of very different identities and questions. And I think we see it very clearly when we look at what is happening in the Syrian opposition, as they are not able to really put together a settlement, at least among those who want to overthrow the regime, of what the consensus would be on which to start and on which to base a transition. So I think that is still a factor that is important in preventing that kind of consensus, also on an elite basis.
Thank you. And Amal, do you have something to add?
Yeah, two comments, two short comments. One, I tend to agree with Muriel concerning your point on authoritarian political Islam. I mean, when we look at what's going on in Egypt as well as in Tunisia now after the elections, the tendency is actually not to overtake the system. The tendency of the Islamic parties is not to take the system, but rather to share it. This doesn't mean that they don't want to be the most important political power. But the democratic procedure is becoming very important in order to legitimize their power. So that's why I like what Wolfgang said about hybrid regimes. It's going to be with clear democratic procedures, but substantially it's going to be, of course, keeping the power of these parties and this combination. I mean, in other words, democratic procedures are going to be used as a legitimation mechanism in order to maintain certain coalitions of power. I think, and this is maybe in the short run. I mean, we can't tell what's going to happen in the long run. And here, the differentiation that Wolfgang made between the modernization theory, structural theory, and actor-centered analysis, they're not mutually exclusive. Actually, what I try to say is that they work together, and that's why it's hard to tell what's going to happen in the far future from now. But what we see is that political elites that had power are not willing. Had power or know that have social backing are not willing to give it up or want to institutionalize it in such a way that maintain it in their own hands, also when they have to pay the price of the democratic procedures. Yeah, so democratization doesn't mean, doesn't have to look something, positive in this regard. It could be something else.
Thank you very much. I'd like to interject because I have a reinforcement of the question of Larry and Wolfgang, if I may, and suggest something. It seems to me that the difference, partly, on the question of the immediate, the actors, and possible pacts, and on what Larry emphasized as the apparent, and I emphasize the apparent political dominance of Islamic forces.
Yeah, you've got to make a distinction. I'm not that worried about Tunisia.
Yes, I understand. I understand. Perhaps the reason behind the question relates to the degree of organization of the actors involved. And because some of the actors are highly organized, and we know exactly who they are, then given the fact that other actors, ones that actually Yoram emphasizes being very important, are so amorphous organizationally and in leadership terms, this can help explain some of the differences in the immediate future. And by the way, just theoretically, I would argue very strongly that has very strong structural elements to it. So that, to reinforce what Amal just said, it seems to me that it's very difficult to distinguish between the agents and the structural elements. They do combine, otherwise we wouldn't have middle-term theory. You, sir, were the next person who wanted to ask a question. Yes, please. No, sorry, not you, the person behind you.
Professor Meital, with regard to the use of the term revolution, I know that is the term used in Egypt, but if we understand revolution as a fundamental change of the regime, politically, economically, socially, that still may happen in Egypt, but so far it did not. If we take the elite, except for a limited number of persons ousted or brought to justice, the elite is practically the same, economically, politically, socially. And a second question, is the removal of President Mubarak solely to the credit of the demonstrators, or also to the credit of the regime who decided to sacrifice Mubarak in order to ensure its survival and continuity?
Good question. Thank you very much. Please be brief, and the answers are going to be brief as well. Dr. Ariel.
Still a bit off topic, but I think it's important. It relates to Muriel's Asseburg presentation. You mentioned something about the geopolitical context and also the American and European perspectives on that. And I'm interested in the foreign policy, exactly, in the foreign policy aspect of that seen from Germany. I mean, you are a member of one of the most distinguished think tanks on foreign policy in the country, so I would like to profit from your expertise on that. And it seems to me that, as a non-expert, that there was a line, that there was a line in foreign policy thinking in Germany in the last, not 10 years, but very much following the Iraq War, to say, let's keep stability. I mean, there was a lot of talk about, dialogue, and in 2009 there was still, let's expand close relationship with Iran, with the regime in Iran, which in April 2009 then came July the demonstrations, and maybe Assad could be a pillar of stability, some sort of sponsoring for Israeli-Palestinian peace. I think that was line also advanced by your think tank, and I wonder if you consider now the events of the Arab Spring as something that's changing this perspective, or was that not the perspective to begin with? And if perspective changes, then it's the kind of process of thinking about, well, how to think differently, or that's it.
Thank you. Question clear. Last question, very, very briefly, and then 2 minutes for each panelist, because I'm afraid that's it. Last question. Yes, sir. Question, please.
Do you, to all of you, do you feel that certain mute actors should be given a voice? There are many minorities that have been discriminated, have been evicted from their homes, starting with the Nubians in Egypt. We all know about the problems of the Copts and the Kurds. There's the Assyrians. There's the South Sahara Republic that was a war, sort of speaking,
Western
by the UN. And there's scores of others. And we don't hear anything about all of these.
Thank you. So I understand the question is about the minorities. Thank you very much. Which one of you wants to go first? This is your only choice today. Yes, Amal, you start.
Very briefly, concerning, I'll start with I think that the process of the process taking place. The minorities were a very involved part in it. In Syria, definitely the Kurds are involved. In Egypt, the Copts were involved. I mean, if I generalize the question, I think the new political agents that were mobilized, or political actors that mobilized into the streets, were, of course, have a completely different vision of the future of the state in which they acted than what the political as well as the social structure will allow the political elites to develop at least in the near future. I think there is a gap there between expectations and what is possible, including because of regional reasons. And I think the role of the Egyptian army is very, very indicative when it comes to national security. And I think it's playing this card very, very heavily when it comes to changes. And I think the interview that was given by the head of the military council a few weeks ago concerning what the Egyptians should do is very indicative as to what the army expects the people to do. Go to work and we will finish the job.
Thank you.
I will pick the question on German foreign policy, and
I didn't think you wouldn't.
Great. Oh. But it's also complicated. But what I think you aim at, I will try to answer that. When we look at German foreign policy towards the region in general terms, it is very much in the mainstream of European policies, and that means there is a contradiction between one, wanting to support transformation in the region, political and economic, and having done a lot to do so, and two, stabilization, meaning support for stagnating systems. Now, what you mentioned with regards to Syria and Iran, however, is not about seeing those as pillars of stability in the region and therefore maintaining good relations with them. But the idea was that in German foreign policy circles, and as you say, rightly supported also by people in our institute, that it is better to engage than to isolate. So this is about the idea that through dialogue, you might be able to affect change. Through isolation, the chance that you will affect any kind of change is very minimal.
Thank you.
And that hasn't changed.
Thank you very much. Yoram.
As for the terminology that we use, of course there is the terminology of the users or the revolutionaries. We talk about Egypt and other places. They use the term Thawra, revolution, and you can take this from my presentation. I would like to use actually two terms. The first is the uprising. Toppling down a regime by civil forces or parties, I would term and use it in my presentations as Arab uprising. As for the, intifada, in a way. It is used by not few, although I would say that we don't have the time to go to this, but if we go to the political discourse, you can take that using revolution was very much about hopes, about expectations for a broad, comprehensive change. Now, as I see it as a more gradual process, I tend to use the term Arab transformation. I'm not using in my writing the term Arab revolution. I'm using the term Arab transformation. First and foremost, because not all Arab uprising will lead to these comprehensive changes that the revolutionaries and maybe some others from the outside would like to see taking place. Now, as for the question about the second question that you raised, of course, the causes for toppling down Mubarak or Gaddafi or tomorrow, inshallah, Bashar al-Assad, causes are varied, and we can, I think, say that taking them all together could produce this. But, well, to my mind, the most important thing is about the agencies that produce this solidarity, this struggle through this difficult process of the uprising. And if I will just, in very brief, will give my take on the Egyptian case, I would say that the brutal use of force by the Mukhabarat, the brutal use by force by security apparatus was one of the most distinctive and important agency during the 18 days that toppled down Mubarak's regime. This is a factor that is not been mentioned or given that much of importance, but just have a second of thinking. At the very beginning of the uprising, we have in Tahrir Square a couple of thousands of people. At the high time of the uprising, we have had hundreds of thousands and sometimes even been close to 1 million. And we have similar models in other cities all over the Republic of Egypt. Now, my answer or claim is that the brutal use of force, the running of cars on citizens, the killing of hundreds of protesters, this was the agency that actually took millions of Egyptians to support, even if not participated practically in the street, to support. And I met in Tahrir Square old people. They are not using Facebook. They were there. And they came because they said the regime lost its legitimacy by using this brutal force.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking really a superb set of papers and presentations. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I have, before you leave, this is an opportunity because the next session is very different. Please, your indulgence for 1.5 more minutes. Just to thank all the people who came from abroad for just enriching us immensely. And I know it's an effort but I want you to know that you have no idea how you have our minds reeling for a long time. So thank you so much for coming. And it was a pleasure hosting you. We hope to see you again. And finally, the next session is on a small little topic called the future of democracy in Israel. And it will be conducted in Hebrew, but there will be simultaneous translation. Thank you very much.